The following is the continuing story of Cynthia Henderson, who along with psychotherapist Peter Ramster travelled to France and drove to Normandy searching for answers about Cynthia's past life as Amelie de Cheville. The Chateau. Before their drive, Cynthia was hypnotised so she could participate in a conversation in French, the language that would have been familiar to her 200 years before. The translator was a man called Antoine Le Breton, and Cynthia was taken back to life in France in the 18th century, and he asked her to converse with Antoine in French, which she did not consciously understand or speak. Surprisingly, Cynthia fully understood what Antoine said to her and answered him in fluent French. Sometimes Cynthia answered his questions in French and sometimes in English. Antoine was astonished and said she spoke French well, as a Frenchwoman spoke it, devoid of any English accent. Furthermore, he said she spoke like someone from the 18th century, as some of her words were old-fashioned. The startling occurrence was her French accent, where her strong English accent disappeared. Even the English she spoke while doing this sometimes had a French accent. She said that she had spoken both French and English during that life, but awake she had no knowledge of the French language. The next day they were to drive to Amelie's childhood home near Fleurs. However, the scenery may have changed, which may throw Cynthia off the scent and confuse her recall. Before they left, Peter asked her to reiterate the memories of the roads she rode along in the coach, like a hill, a valley, the road and countryside, and the wall that surrounded the chateau grounds. Cynthia again described the chateau, with its towers and protruding steps and entrance, and the lakes, paths and walkways on its grounds. She described the windows and the interior. The doors and porch of the chateau are the first things you see when you come down the drive, and two towers at the back. Cynthia was able to lead them along roads she had never before in this life travelled, and she seemed to know where she was. But they suddenly came upon a new road where Cynthia became confused, but soon recognised where she was and picked up the lead. Suddenly, Cynthia could see what looked like the wall of the chateau. The chateau grounds were now large parklands, and Cynthia became tense as they drove along because she knew where she was and had recognised the drive. She then said, "Oh God, there it is," as the chateau came into view. Her description of the chateau under hypnosis was correct when she said that the most striking features are the doors and the porch, because that's the first thing you see when you come down the drive. There in front of them was the ruin of a large old chateau, a building that had once been very elegant. When they approached the tower at the back of the chateau, the sight of the tower triggered a burst of emotion, and Cynthia began to cry. The chateau she remembered now stood before her as a ruin. One could still see a tower, the porch, the entrance, the walls, the windows. Initially, Cynthia was in a state of shock, but after composing herself, took them on the tour of her old home. As they entered, Cynthia showed familiarity and gave them a guided tour as she remembered it. They then climbed the tower and looked out over the magnificent views from the top. The tower was at the back as Cynthia had remembered, but there were two towers in her memory. Unfortunately, the chateau had been bombed during World War II and was never restored. Under hypnosis in Sydney, Cynthia had recalled that the lake was an important focus of the early part of her life and was a short walk from the chateau, which was where Cynthia recalled some of the parties. Cynthia then spoke about the different parts of the property and her clothing, where she wore big hats and her favourite dresses were deep purple with cream lace and a collar that was ruffled at the front. It had wide sleeves with ruffles of lace around. Everything came back to her so clearly. Everywhere she walked, memories flooded back. Cynthia said that when she was first regressed, she thought it was just her imagination. But as they walked around, she seemed to know every bend. She said she felt as if she belonged, as she recognised everything. As they started walking around, she had images of the coaches and the clothes and the people, the servants and the parties. She said that she had always had feelings for the French era, and now realised they were real people, not just something she'd read in books or seen in films. It's as if I had amnesia for 200 years. Country house with chapel. Under hypnosis, Cynthia spoke of a friend's country house where she spent many holidays. As they drove onto the road around the coast, only Cynthia knew where they were going, which was a memory from 200 years ago. Her friend's house was situated a few miles from the coast, along with the landmarks that reminded her of her former life. Cynthia was able to describe the locations of small streams and bends in the roads before they even got there. The old country roads that had existed for many years had again become fresh in her memory. She described the U-shaped country house as being on the right-hand side of the road. She said it had a courtyard, that the centre section had an archway through which the coaches used to pass. She also described the small chapel near the house, not only its position, but its external and internal appearance, down to such details as the colour of the glass in the windows and the shape and design of the tiles on the floor. She then pointed to a road veering off to the right and was able to direct them along with a number of roads and never took a wrong turn. She spoke of a stream they would cross shortly before they crossed it, and then informed them that the place was very close. It was on the right, around a turn in the road, and she was correct again. They drove through the gates and into the front courtyard of the property. It was occupied and had not been bombed during the war, so it was still intact and was exact in every detail to Cynthia's early description. It was U-shaped with a courtyard and an archway to which the coaches could enter. They walked around the courtyard to where some children came out, followed by adults. The adults told them that the house and chapel were built hundreds of years ago. Cynthia was revisiting a place she'd been fond of, and it looked as she expected it to be. When they went to walk to the chapel, they started to walk around the property, but Cynthia remembered a shortcut and led them a different way. They went up to the door of the chapel, but it was locked, and asked the priest to gain access. Before entering, Cynthia described the inside of the chapel to the priest, where Antoine acted as interpreter, and asked the priest if he could confirm her description, which he did. Then the priest opened the chapel. Most of what Cynthia had told Peter Ramster in Sydney before they left was validated. A statue, wooden pews, and a hexagonal stone font on the left. A large cross and blue-grey diamond-shaped tiles on the floor. They were all as she described was under hypnosis. These were facts that would seem impossible for her to have known. It was remarkable evidence for the life she recalled. Evidence for reincarnation had constantly been found, and Cynthia's memories were accurate in so many ways. The chapel had proved evidential, as there was no way Cynthia could have known about the blue-grey tiles or the other features of the chapel she described in Sydney under hypnosis before they left for Europe. Paris. Before going to Paris, Cynthia was again hypnotised and asked about the house where she'd lived with her husband, the house from which she was taken by the mob during the Revolution. Cynthia said that she lived with her husband on the Rue Saint-Georges in Paris after they married in Fleurs and drove by coast to Verneuil. Cynthia was able to draw a detailed picture of the house. It was north of the river and in the middle of Paris, north of the Tuileries, a royal residence. She also drew a map of the River Seine in relation to where the Rue Saint-Georges was. Their translator Antoine studied his road map as he wasn't from Paris and located the point in the river drawn by Cynthia. He also found that the Rue Saint-Georges was located exactly in the position that she had stated. They stopped a few hundred yards short of the Rue Saint-Georges, but Cynthia sensed where the Rue Saint-Georges was, but had not been told that a great deal had changed. They then turned into the street they were looking for, where Cynthia then pointed to where her home had been, but was now a modern building. The streets were different, and the house was gone, but the Rue Saint-Georges still remained in the same position relative to the river. For Cynthia, being back in Paris reminded her of the end of her life, of the angry mobs, the rats, the guillotine, and the terror she experienced. All in all, most of the buildings and relics of a former life memory did exist and were as she described. She knew what turns to take along the road and was an accomplishment beyond chance, and the results of their journey with Cynthia added a new chapter to reincarnation research. On arriving in France, Cynthia's memories were made fully conscious to her, where the dreamlike images were actually real places she had experienced before. Many emotions from that life had returned, where she became immersed in the countryside she had long since forgotten.